There it is. So last week, I may have made a little bit presumptuous statement that we would get through 2 churches tonight. Not going to happen, especially with this one. I don't know what I was thinking. I told Kara that, and she said, "Well, I knew that when you said that." She knows me pretty good. Yeah. Especially now, I could go over this church easily for a month. I wish I could, but I ain't going to. This is, to me, one of the most fascinating churches, and one that I could study the most. Definitely. I don't know. This is the one that I would spend the most time on. And we're going to be looking at one of their main characters that came out of that church mostly tonight, because he really fulfills what Christ is telling this church. And again, if we're on the church, of course, of Smyrna, Revelations 2:8. And I believe they are, each of these churches, the letters of the churches, they are actual churches. These things are really going on. But if they represented dispensational times, which I think they do, so there's seven church periods that's happened. The first one we went over, Ephesus, that's of course the apostolic church. That's when the apostles were in charge of the church, and that was from Christ. Well, actually, I guess you would say that would be from the day of Pentecost until about 100 A.D., and that's about when the last apostle died, John. So John would have been the last apostle. He died really close to 100 A.D. It was 9900. That's what they pinpointed it to about that time period. Does anybody know where he died? No. Ephesus. Yeah. He was on Patmos until about 97 A.D., and then the emperor let him free because he was on Patmos. He was. They send you there essentially to die. You're secluded. They banished him there because of his preaching, and finally got another emperor, and he allowed him to be freed. And then he goes to Ephesus, spends about 2 years, and then he dies. But anyway, that ended the apostolic church age, that first church age. And so then we get into the second church age, and that's the letter we're at now. If you believe that these are church ages, I just want to keep saying that because that's not just a given. So you can believe either way on that, but that's okay. But I believe they are, and I believe that when you read the Christ warnings and Christ's blessings to each church, you can see the church age that they were in, and it does follow in line with up till today where we're at. And so Smyrna is, of course, the persecuted church. And that is when the Christian church went under a extreme persecution. The apostles suffered some persecution. Most of them were martyred, of course, but there wasn't like an empire-wide persecution of the church. And a lot of people think like the first 300 years of the church, there was like a non-stop empire-wide persecution. And that's not true. There's really only 2, maybe 3 periods of empire-wide persecutions. And we'll talk about that tonight too. We'll get into who mainly caused those empire-wide persecutions. But that doesn't mean the church wasn't persecuted, because most of the persecution in that 300 years was localized. It would be local villages, local towns, and the people of the villages and towns turned against the Christians. And then and we're going to see that with Smyrna. Smyrna was, especially with Smyrna, that they turned against them. And we'll see that first they made it to where they couldn't work. That was the first part of their persecution. They made it to where they couldn't work, so the Christians were in extreme poverty. And then secondly, after that, of course, they started imprisoning them and martyred them. And we'll see that tonight as too. So the persecution church age we usually talk about, and I believe that this church, Smyrna, is the placement of that, is from 100 AD, after the apostolic church, 100 AD to 316 AD. So there's 216 years of extreme persecution to the Christian church. Now again, that's not the whole time empire-wide persecutions, but 2 or 3 empire-wide, but constant persecution in different places. But we'll see as we get into this, it was really bad. But why did it stop in 316? Anybody know? No, you're only 1,200 years off. Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, he ended that persecution. And so that's what stopped the persecution in 316. All right, so let's get into Smyrna. I think what I'm going to do, I have so much stuff, content. Like I said, I was studying, I told Guy, I said, I had to stop. I said, I'll be on this for 6 weeks. Yeah, well. So I think I'm just going to read through it, 8 through 11, and then just get into it. And again, we're mainly going to be talking about one martyred, the most famous martyred person out of Smyrna, because I think the picture of his life and the picture of his martyrdom encapsulates the church of Smyrna and what Christ is telling them. And one positive note on Smyrna is Christ has not one negative thing to say about him. That's very rare in these 7 churches, that Christ doesn't say one negative thing about it. And you can see in the persecuted church that when you read the church history, that's one of my favorite things to do is study church history. And so I've studied the first 400 years. I've probably I just went through a 70-hour study of the church history, just the first 400 years. And what's so fascinating is the martyrdoms, is the faithfulness and the commitment of people that never would have dreamed that they would have had the strength to go through tortures. And I mean, it was terrible the way they tortured them. Rome was so cruel in how they dealt with people, and they would feed them to the wild animals, of course, and they would bull them. They would put wax on them and burn their bodies really slowly. Just horrible tortures. But little women, that was, terrified, saying, well, I'll never, talk. You can read their actual letters to their parishioner or their priest or pastor or whatever, and talking about how they were terrified that when it came, that they wouldn't be able to stand faithful. And then the priest, would say, just trust the Lord. If the time comes, He'll give you the grace. He'll give you the strength. And one in particular, I'm thinking of this little woman, and they tried to kill her like 3 times. I can't remember her name. It was horrible. Like they fed her to the animals. The animals mauled her, but it didn't kill her. And then they did something else, didn't kill her. But the whole time that they're doing this to her, all these other Christians are with her, and she is encouraging everybody. She's encouraging everybody to stand faithful to Christ to the end. Do not deny Him. She said, He is worth it. And so she lived through 3 martyrdoms till they finally did kill her. But she was afraid she wouldn't make it through, but she actually encouraged everybody in the prison by her faithfulness to Christ. So let's get into it. Verse 8, we'll read through 11. And it says, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. So he is making sure they know who is giving them this letter. He's making sure they know who this is. It's Christ. The first and the last, the one who was dead and now is alive. He says, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. Again, I told you the persecution had already started in that they were taking away their employment. Because Smyrna is a coastal city, and it was extremely wealthy, extremely wealthy. So it was very unusual to have poor people there because it was so prosperous. But yet, the Christians were extremely poverty-stricken. They weren't until the persecution started, and then they started taking away their rights and taking away their right to work, and finally they started imprisoning them. So he says, I know thou workest in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation. So Jesus is warning them what's getting ready to happen. And it does, especially in Smyrna. Smyrna went through an extreme persecution. And he says, tribulation, 10 days, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So he warns them that the extreme persecution's coming. He warns them that many of them are going to be cast into prison, not all of them. It's not going to be a total persecution, but he's saying many of you are going to get thrown into prison, and he's warning them again. He's letting them know, if you get thrown into prison, you're probably going to be martyred. You're going to die. So he's just letting them know so they can be prepared that when they get cast into prison, they don't have to have some false hope, but they can prepare themselves for meeting the Lord and prepare themselves to stand fast in the face of martyrdom. And it says, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. And so we see that Christ is commending the church of Smyrna for their work and for their tribulation that they withstood already and what they're going to withstand, because Christ is God and he's omnipotent and or omniscient, and he knows that they are going to be martyred, and he knows that they're going to stand fast in the face of that. And he knows that they're in poverty because their jobs and everything else has been taken away from them because of their stance for Christ. And so this kind of flies in the face of prosperity gospel preachers that believe that, God's will for all of us is to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, because Christ tells us that we're going to suffer persecution. That at times and throughout history, we're going to suffer extreme persecution. And he warns us not to be fearful, because when the persecution does come, we people that do deny him, and that becomes another whole issue for the church, is called the lax debate, and it's people who did end up sacrificing to other gods, and whether to let them back into the church, and if so, how long to keep them out of the church until they've proven themselves faithful again. Because that was a serious thing. Today, and I wish we had some of this back, but today you get mad in church for any reason, you just go across the street and go to another church. Nobody cares. Nobody does anything. There's no authority. There's no power. There's no nothing. It's just, you get mad over there, you go somewhere else. You get mad over there, you go somewhere else. And so there's church hopping. Here, in this time, in the original church, if you was banished from the church, if you was excommunicated, you didn't join any other church. You were outside of the body of Christ. You were outside of the body of Christ, because the church is the body of Christ, and so it was the most fearful thing for a church member to be excommunicated. And so when these people were sacrificing to the other gods, and then the church had no choice but to excommunicate them because they had denied Christ, and so that was a serious matter. And so the church finally decided, mostly, now this went on for 200-300 years, this debate over these lax. They called it the lax debate. The people were lax. They denied Christ by doing a sacrifice to the other gods. And so I think they mostly ended up with 2 years, that you had to be outside of the church for 2 years. You could still attend services, listen to the preaching, but you were not part of the body of Christ. You were not part of the church. You couldn't do any functions. You couldn't go to baptisms. You couldn't do any of that until 2 years, and you had to prove that you truly were repentative and that you truly were committed and faithful to Christ. And so it was a serious thing back then, not so much now. But anyway, so we find in Smyrna today is modern Izmir, Turkey. It's about 50 miles north of Ephesus. And again, it's a coastal town. It was extremely wealthy during that day. And this is my favorite thing about Smyrna is, and I think I told y'all this last week. I wish I wouldn't have. Did I tell you what Smyrna means? I'll say it again anyway. Smyrna means myrrh. So you know myrrh, the oil and the fragrance. Nicodemus, they anointed Christ's body with myrrh. We went over that in Bible study Monday. Nicodemus brought 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe to anoint the body of Christ when he died. That was worth, in today's money, $150,000 to $200,000. That was a big deal. That's how much he thought of Jesus. And so myrrh was more costly than gold sometimes in the ancient times. It was worth more than gold. So Smyrna means myrrh because that's where a lot of the myrrh came from. But what's fascinating, and I was talking to Caleb about this last night, how amazing God is and how his word, like he doesn't waste anything. God doesn't waste word. That's why I'm so captivated by studying like every word and every verse of the scripture, because there's not one word in this book that's wasted. It all means something. It all is glorifying God in some way. And so I look for meaning in everything. I look for and I prayed for God to reveal to me what he's saying. So Smyrna, this is the persecuted church, means myrrh. Well, myrrh, if I had a handful of myrrh right now, it wouldn't do us any good. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't do anything with it. It'd be hard like a rock. The only way that myrrh can be useful to us is either to be pressed or to be burned. And when you press or burn myrrh, then it releases that beautiful fragrance. That's when it's most useful, and that's when it's most beautiful. And so it is with the church. And this represents the persecuted church, that when the church is pressed and burned, that is when it releases its most beautiful fragrance. That is when it's a sweet-smelling savor to God, when he sees the faithfulness of his people, to allow them to show him how much they truly love him, and they're willing to die for him, just like he was willing to die for them. That I just love that it means myrrh, because myrrh is only useful when it's pressed and burned in the church. That's when the church has grown exponentially. This is what caused the church to be spread throughout the whole world, was the persecution. Because when the persecution started in Jerusalem, then they spread out to different parts of the Roman Empire, and then the persecution started throughout the whole Roman Empire. Then they started spreading out throughout the whole world, into Asia and Africa and everywhere else. And so persecution, when the church is pressed and when the church is burned, then she releases her beautiful fragrance, and then she grows and she fulfills her glorified purpose of glorifying God on this wicked world. And so why is Smyrna so wicked, the town, the city itself? Well, I'm going to tell you, the reason the persecution was so severe and so sudden in Smyrna, probably before the other places so much, is because in 195 A.D., there was a temple built in Smyrna to Dea Roma, or the goddess of Rome. So they built this absolutely gigantic temple that was known throughout the whole Roman world to this deity, Dea Roma, the goddess of Rome. They gain a reputation for being totally loyal to Rome. Okay, so Smyrna builds this gigantic temple to the goddess of Rome because they want to prove and show, because they're not Roman, but they're part of the Roman Empire. But they want to show their absolute allegiance to Rome. So why is this a problem for the church? Do you know what the church, the martyrs were martyred for? Why they were persecuted in this 300-year span? Because they were accused of being atheist. So Christians in the first 3 centuries were put to death, and their bill of what do you call it? Allegations against them was that they were atheists. And that's why they were put to death, not because they didn't believe in a God, but because they didn't believe in their gods. Rome, whenever they would take over parts of the world, they did not care what gods you served. They did not disrupt your worship to your gods, but they were concerned with you adding their gods to your gods. That you better make sure that you can offer sacrifices to your gods all you want, because they believed there was many gods, and they actually encouraged you to keep your tradition, keep your religion, because they thought in their minds the more gods that are happy, the better off they'll be. But of course, Juniper or Jupiter and their gods, they definitely wanted to keep them happy, and so they forced everybody to sacrifice, except for 2 people at the beginning. They didn't make Jews do that, because Jews were so monotheistic that Jews would just say, we'll die. We won't worship. We'll just die. And then Christians came along and said the same thing. Said, well, no, we can't sacrifice to anybody else. It was okay for a while, but then when problems started to happen throughout the empire, guess why the emperor thinks the gods are mad at him? Because these Christians aren't sacrificing to my gods. Jupiter is angry at us because we have these subjects who are not sacrificing to them. So they're causing us all these problems. So we're either going to force, and that's what they tried to do. They wanted to force the Christians to sacrifice to them. And if they wouldn't, then they would put you in prison, persecute you, and then martyr you. But all you had to do was sacrifice. But that was the whole thing with them. So in 195 AD, so this was way before Christ, they had already built this gigantic temple to prove their allegiance to Rome, and it was to the Roman goddess Dea Roma. And again, they had to offer sacrifices to her. So if somebody lives in Smyrna, they're a Smyrnite, and they're very wealthy, prosperous, and they're working in the shipyard or whatever, they're in shipping and receiving. And all of a sudden, somebody preaches you the gospel. Say John comes along, like he did to Polycarp, preaches the gospel, and you get saved. Well, all of a sudden, you're not at the temple of Dea Roma anymore. You're not sacrificing to her anymore. And everybody's going to start noticing this, and they're going to stop doing trade with you. And then if anything bad happens in the town, you're focused. That's your fault, because you're not sacrificing to her anymore. But that ain't all. So in 25 AD, there was many cities throughout the Roman Empire that competed for the honor of building another temple, to the Emperor Tiberius. So this was Caesar Tiberius, and he wanted this gigantic temple made for him, again, claiming he is deity, claiming he's Kyrios, God, he's God. And so he wants to build this gigantic temple, and then he wants everybody to come and make sacrifices there at his temple. Well, guess who wins the honor of building this? Smyrna. So now they have these 2 huge pagan temples in Smyrna. They got the the Dea Roma, and then the Emperor Tiberius temple. And so the Christians were extremely persecuted for not participating in worshiping either of these supposed gods. So there's two temples, two massive temples in this small city of Smyrna that everybody in the whole city is coming to often and making sacrifices in both to keep both these gods happy. Everybody but the Christians. And everybody in the city sees this. And when anything starts going wrong, anything starts going bad, or the economy starts dropping in the least, it's obviously because the Christians are not sacrificing to these gods. So you can see how out of hand this gets really quick. This becomes a mob mentality, that if your economy starts to drop just a little bit, everybody in the town agrees it's their faults because they're not sacrificing to the gods. Everything was good for all these hundreds of years until they stopped sacrificing to the gods. And so now it becomes extreme persecution. So that was 25 AD. That's after the death of Christ. But again, this is the time of, this is well after the time John wrote Revelations and well after the time Polycarp died in Smyrna. So, so now that's Smyrna. That's the whole deal with Smyrna, is they're this very wealthy coastal town who has two gigantic temples. And so this is what Christ is warning them. This is what's coming. Like this, there's extreme persecution coming to you, and it's going to be awful. And so now I want to look at Polycarp, because Polycarp would have been 20 years old when this letter, he would have been in the congregation, he was already a Christian, he would have been 20 years old when this letter was delivered to Smyrna. And I think that's so awesome. Because Polycarp, he dies when he's 86, by the way. And so Polycarp's in this congregation. He's sitting here when they receive this letter from John, the letter, not just the letter to their church, but the whole letter of Revelation. And this would have been read to them, the whole church. And so Polycarp would have been sitting there listening to this letter being read. So he would have been 20 years old. And he was believed, this I don't know, I'm not sure about, but it was believed that Polycarp was saved under John's preaching, the one who wrote the book of Revelations. But we were very confident that John is the one who made Polycarp the bishop of Smyrna. So Polycarp becomes the bishop of Smyrna. He becomes the bishop of this town. And the reason I'm going over his life, because he is going to be the epitome of this letter. He is the one that's going to be martyred, and we'll see in his life how destructive it was. But before I get to that, I do want to give the emperors. So there's 8 emperors, or no, there's 10 emperors that were over Rome from 37 AD to 305. Now, this might not interest you a bit, so I'll kind of go quickly, but it might interest some of you. But there's 2 at least, well, 3, that were empire-wide, I'll say 2, but maybe 3, empire-wide persecutions of the church, meaning that the emperor himself decreed an empire-wide persecution of the church. It only happened like 2 times, and there was a short one, and then there was a long one. And so Nero, he was from 37 to 68. You probably heard him, Emperor Nero. He's the one who killed Paul. He beheaded Paul. He was extremely evil. All these guys are evil, wicked. So there's Nero. Not so much of an empire-wide persecution of the church, because the church is just being founded. Nero hated Christians, blamed them for burning his city in Rome, but still not so much of an empire-wide persecution. So Nero, Vespasian, he was the next, 69 to 79. And all these, there was persecution of the church, by the way. I want to say that. None of these emperors were for Christians. They allowed persecution.
Did they think that Nero burned it himself and blamed
He did burn it himself,
Yeah.
and watched it.
That's what I thought.
And then he blamed the Jews.
Right.
That's why he didn't blame the Christians, he blamed the Jews. That's why the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. That was by Nero. So the temple and Jerusalem itself was destroyed. He leveled it to the ground. And that's what Jesus said, that he told his disciples the temple, not one stone is going to be left upon the foundation, pointing to the temple. And then in 70 AD that was accomplished. And the reason, I don't know if you know this, but the reason the temple, like there is not one stone left on the foundation of the whole Herod's temple. This was a massive temple dedicated to God. It was the temple in Israel. Huge. But the reason that there wasn't one stone left upon the whole foundation, and you can go over there today and it's still, you can see the rubble laying in front of the foundation where they pushed them off. But it's because Nero had them burn it. Had them burn the whole temple with the curtain, the Holy of Holies, and the holy room and everything in it. He burned it all. Well, do you know what the whole temple was filled with? Everything was overlain with gold. And so like an idiot, he goes in there and burns the whole thing. Well, the gold melts and it seeps into the stones. And so now they've got this burnt place with gold seeped into the stones. And then he says, oh, maybe we should have got the gold out first. He says, I want you to take it stone by stone and get the gold out from between the rocks. And so that's what they did. And you can go over there today and you can see the giant boulders. You can see the foundation of the whole temple, flat, just flat. There's nothing on it. And then you can see all the giant boulders down the hill in front of it, where the Roman soldiers took it rock by rock, just exactly like Jesus said. Not one stone will be left standing. And so that was in 70 A.D. by Nero. And it was completely destroyed. And then Vespasian, he's the next one. He didn't like Christians. None of these people like Christians. Domitian was next. Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Maximus the Thracian, Decius, Valerian, and the last, and this is the absolute worst one. This was the worst persecutor of the church by far, Diocletian. Diocletian was from 284 to 305, right before Constantine. That's one of the reasons Constantine was helped the church so much, is because of what Diocletian did to him. He was the most wicked. He enjoyed, I think it was mother-in-law or somebody became Christian, and he had her tortured to death. I mean, he was just evil. Diocletian was the worst. But anyway, Eusebius, he was a Jewish historian around 340 AD. He died in 340 AD. But Eusebius says that Polycarp died under Marcus Aurelius in 167 and 168, but most accounts have Polycarp died in 155. So I don't know about that. Don't really matter to me. But anyway, let's get to Polycarp and see what happened with him. So Polycarp, again, he would have been 20 years old when he got this letter to Smyrna. He already knew John. We believe pretty confidently that he was saved under the Apostle John, and then that the Apostle John actually anointed him Bishop of Smyrna. And so Polycarp, he avoided a lot of the persecution, but finally a lot of his church members were persecuted and martyred. But finally in 156 AD, again, that's what most accounts give, 156 AD. Eusebius says 167, 168. I don't think Eusebius is right, but anyway, Polycarp, about 156 AD, they tell Polycarp that his persecutors, the Roman guards, are coming to arrest him in Smyrna. And so they're begging him to run away. He's 86 years old. They're begging him to flee. They're begging him. So he could have saved himself, but Polycarp says, absolutely not. I'm not going to flee. I'm not going to go anywhere. So they finally come, the men, to arrest him. And when they get there, Polycarp feeds them and gives them drink. And so he takes care of them, and then he asks them if he could have some time to pray, and they say yes. And he prays for 2 hours. And then they take him off, taking him back to Rome. Or let's see, where did they take him? I can't remember exactly where Polycarp died. It could have been Smyrna. They might have, I don't know. Anyway, they took him to the proconsul. That's a council of Roman judges, like we would have a court today, a Supreme Court. And so they take him in front of the proconsul, these Roman officers, and what is he being charged with? He's being charged with blasphemy, yes, blasphemy, and not acknowledging Caesar, Curios Caesar. I've told y'all before that the main reason Christians were persecuted, the main reason Christians were hated by Romans, especially Roman officials, is because everybody under the Roman Empire was required to say Curios Caesar, or Caesar Curios, which means Caesar is Lord. Christians can't say that. There's only one Lord. And so they're taking him back, and the guards, as they're taking Polycarp back, they're begging him, because nobody wants to see Polycarp die. Nobody wants to see this 86-year-old man tortured and put to death. Even the guards. Like I said, he fed him and gave him drink when he got there. He was super courteous to him. And so they're begging him as they're taking him back, please, just stop this. Just go ahead, say Curios Caesar, and denounce Christ. And he says, no, I can't do that. So they take him in front of the proconsul. So he's here before the Supreme Court of Rome. His life is in their hands. Whatever they say is going to happen immediately. Unlike now, if they give you the death sentence, you go to the Supreme Court, you've still got another 40 years to live. You've got about 2 hours to live once these guys say, off with your head, you're done. And so he stands before the proconsul, and they ask him, they begged him, even the proconsul, they do not want to kill this 86-year-old man. And they say, turn from Christ. Just say, Curios Caesar, and revile Christ. That's all you have to say, and we'll let you go, and we will not bother you again. You can go back to your life and do whatever it is you do. And Polycarp's reply, he says, for 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? How can I do that? And so immediately they take Polycarp into the theater. They say, we're going to release these wild animals on you. They're going to tear you to pieces. He said, release them. Let them come in. And then they see that's not working. And then they say, well, we'll burn you at the stake, thinking that'll put more fear into him. And he says, put me up there. I do not care. And so here, I also want to go back to the scripture because I said Polycarp's life and death kind of follow this letter to Smyrna, how it went on. So he says there in verse 9, I know thy works in tribulation and poverty. I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but the synagogue of Satan. Now, you'll see that ever so often in the scriptures, talking about people who say they're Jews but are not. This is not talking about a national heritage or a national culture. This is not talking about their nationality. This has nothing to do with their nationality. So you have to know that when you read this, because you'll be very confused. You'll think it's like Gentiles acting like Jews, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about, he says, blasphemy of them which say they are Jews. Those who say they are in covenant with God is what he means. Because the Jews, the true Jews, and there's still true Jews, some out there, not many, but there's always been true Jews. Paul was a true Jew. All the apostles were true Jews because they were always in covenant with God. The New Testament, they're still true Jews because they're in covenant with God through Christ. But guess what? Those who do not, who do not come into covenant with God through Christ, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, They're not true Jews. They're of the synagogue of Satan. So it has nothing to do with their nationality. It has everything to do with their covenant with God. And so the Jews believed that they were the only people in covenant with God. And what they failed to realize is God had rejected them. God had rejected them because they rejected his Son. He sent his Son to make new covenant with the people, with all people, and they rejected him. So this saying, blasphemy in them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan, if you reject God's Son and you reject covenant with God because you reject his Son, then you are not in covenant with God, but you are of the synagogue of Satan. There is no other option. And so he says, which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Why I'm saying that is because Polycarp in Smyrna, guess who was his main agitators and guess who was his main persecutors? The Jews. The Jews were the main ones who wanted Polycarp destroyed. They're the main ones who would go to the proconsul. They were the main ones who were going to the local magistrates and saying, listen, this Polycarp is a Christian. He's a bishop. He's causing all kinds of trouble. He won't worship Caesar. He won't worship to the goddess of Dea Roma. He won't do any of these things. He needs to be destroyed. And so they were his main agitators, so much so, and it's a factual record, you can look it up, and this was totally against Jewish tradition, but when they finally condemned Polycarp, this all happened within one day. I told you what he just said to them. The Jews of Smyrna got so excited. They had nothing to do with the Roman council was the one who decreed it, and they were the ones who were going to carry it out. But some of the Jewish people in Smyrna got so excited that they went out and got the wood and carried it in to burn Polycarp. Like they were totally for this, and they were totally participants of it. And so that to me goes right along with what that's saying. Those who say they're Jews but are not, they are the synagogue of Satan. Polycarp was an actual servant of the Lord. Polycarp was in actual covenant with God through his Son Jesus Christ. Polycarp was a servant of God. Those Jews were not. They were of the synagogue of Satan. And they were responsible, or partly responsible, for his death. But they participated in his death, carried out the wood to burn Polycarp because of their hatred for him. Oh, I had Polycarp's speech right here. I didn't even read it. So this is what Polycarp said. It says, then they started to travel back to the city. On the journey, the officer in charge tried to get him to turn away from Jesus. What harm can it do to offer sacrifices to the emperor? But Polycarp refused. On arrival of the city, he was brought before the proconsul, who again tried to get him to turn away from Jesus. They were begging him, just please. Said, just swear by the genius of Caesar, or say Curio Caesar. He said, swear and I will release you. Revile Christ. And that's when Polycarp is reported to have replied, for 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? The proconsuls started again, swear by Caesar. I have wild beasts. If you do not change your mind, I will throw you to them. Polycarp calmly replied, call them then. Because he was not worried about the wild animals, the proconsul decided to have him killed by fire. Angry Jews and Gentiles gathered wood for the fire, and Polycarp stood by the stake. Now this is another thing, is when they led Polycarp up to the stake, they were going to tie him to the stake. And Polycarp says, no tie needed. He says, I'm not going to go anywhere. He says, I'm ready to die. I'm ready to go meet him. He's like, I am prepared. I've been waiting on this day for 86 years to see my Lord, and this is the day. He says, I'm excited. You don't have to tie me. So they didn't tie him. He just stood against the stake. And this is what's recorded. Let me finish this. He then, I'm going to see his specific notes. Yeah, he specifically asked not to be tied to it, so they didn't tie him up. He then prayed aloud, O Lord, Almighty God, the Father of your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, through whom we come to know you, I thank you for counting me worthy this day and this hour for sharing the cup of Christ among the number of your martyrs. He thought it an honor, and he couldn't believe that he was counted worthy to drink of the same cup that Christ drank out of and all those other martyrs. And so the story is that Polycarp stands up there at the stake, and this is even in secular reports as well. And they put him up there and lit all the wood, and the fire was raging above his head. And it says when everybody started looking in the fire, that a wind had come and blown straight down the body of Polycarp, and so the flames were about this far away from him, all the way around in a complete circle, and the flames didn't touch him. And so Polycarp's just sitting there praising the Lord, singing hymns. And finally a Roman soldier comes in and sticks him through with his sword. But the flames never touched him, which was pretty miraculous. But anyway, that was Polycarp's demise. And again, I think it goes right along with, because he was the bishop of Smyrna, and this is what Christ is warning them was going to happen. And that 10 days just means it's going to be short. Your time in prison is going to be short, and then you're going to be martyred. He was just getting them prepared and getting their mindsets ready that this is going to go all the way, and I need you to be ready. And then I want to read it again, because then I want to touch off the last part of the letter. And I'm just going to read the whole thing. It's just 4 verses. And unto the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. So he's announcing this is from Christ. I know thy works in tribulation and poverty. Thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. They were doing the work of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Do not fear the things you're going to suffer. Behold, the devil, so that's who's behind this, the devil. And we're going to see in Pergamos, we think Smyrna was a bad place to live. The next church, Pergamos, is far worse. Far worse place to live than Smyrna. Smyrna is evil, wicked. They were extremely persecuted, but Pergamos, we'll see, is where the seat of Satan actually was. What does that mean? It means Satan was actually working out of that place. Satan is not omnipresent like our God. He's in one place at one time. And he actually has a kingdom, and he's ruling his kingdom, and he's got lots of demons working throughout the world doing his will. And so they're accomplishing things. And when you turn on the news and you see these governments doing these crazy things, like Adolf Hitler, and you see this crazy stuff, you can be assured that Satan is behind it. That he is the God of this world. And so he is controlling all these different political atmospheres and all these wars and rumors of wars and all these things going on. And so we're going to see in Pergamos, he actually had his seat. That actually was his headquarters, at least at that time. And we'll see why when we get into Pergamos. But it was an evil, 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 evil place. But anyway, verse 10 says, Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison. And mind you, Christ is warning them that the devil is going to cast them into prison. Christ is God. God is sovereign. God is creator of all things, including the devil. He could have stopped him at any time. And so we need to be mindful of that God allowed this to happen. This has a purpose. And everything that happens for a purpose by the sovereignty, divine will of God is going to bring him glory in the end. So God allowed the devil to come in here and to persecute God's own children. But he has a purpose and he has a plan, and they are the actual victors. Everything the devil does against us, everything the devil does against the church of the living God, everything the devil did against the Son of the living God when he was here, backfires. God receives the glory, not the devil. The devil never wins. God always wins. God is always the victor. And so he allows this to happen, but God is going to receive glory out of it. And so it says, You may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death. And then he gives them a promise. So first he warns them, and he wants them to be prepared, and he wants them to know some of you are going to be put in prison, and those that are put into prison, those who are strong enough to handle it, he's not going to just let anybody go to, he says, not all of you is going to go to prison, just some of you, and it's those, I believe, that can endure it, that Christ was preparing them. He allowed the strong ones to be put in there so that he would receive glory. And so he says, those of you that are put in prison, he says, you're going to face martyrdom. He says, be faithful unto death. Keep your eyes on me. Don't look at anything else. Don't be fearful. Think about what you're going to see next. Don't allow your flesh, and I wrote a post today because I was thinking of this, that your flesh is actually the barrier between you being in the actual presence of God. And so when you start to see it like that, why do we fear death? It's because we don't fully understand that. The more we start to understand that this fleshly tabernacle is actually the barrier between me and being in the actual physical presence of my God, when you start to really realize that, you'll start to lose all fear of death. Because it's actually a release. That this fleshly tabernacle is my last enemy that I will defeat. It is the only thing that separates me from the actual physical presence of my God. So when I leave this tabernacle, that's my victory. That is my victory. That is when I finally am released from this sinful prison that I'm walking around in, this fleshly tabernacle. And so he says, be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. So there's the promise. You're going to be persecuted, some of you. You're going to be cast into prison, and you're going to die. Be faithful unto death, and if you are, he says, I'm going to give you a crown of life. This is eternal. This few minutes of suffering you're going to endure, it cannot compare to the glory that you're getting ready to receive. No way comparable. So it doesn't matter how much we suffer on this side. Watchman Nee, 20 years in prison. Richard Wurmbrand, 18 years in prison. All for preaching the gospel. Not comparable to what they are experiencing now. Not comparable. It doesn't matter if you spend 80 years in prison here for your love for Christ. It is not comparable to the eternal glory that you're going to receive because you did. This is not comparable. And so verse 11, he says, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. And then he gives another promise. He says, he that overcometh the persecution, overcometh the tribulations, and stays faithful to Christ even unto death, he that overcomes shall not be hurt of the second death. And I was reading Matthew Henry's commentary. I'm not going to read the whole thing, of course, to you, but on this, just the church of Smyrna. And I got a lot out of it, but mostly what I got out of it was just this last verse. Two things. One thing he said, and I love this. He said the conclusion of this message, and that as before. He says, number one, so the message to the Smyrna, the church of Smyrna, Matthew Henry says, with a call to universal attention, that all men, all the world, should hear what passes between Christ and his churches. I love this. How he commends them, how he comforts them, how he reproves their failures, how he rewards their fidelity. It concerns all the inhabitants of the world to observe God's dealings with his own people. All the world may learn instruction and wisdom thereby. So I just love how he worded that, how everybody, all the world should pay attention and their ears should perk up to see how the God of all creation confers and treats and loves his church. How he comforts them, how he protects them, how he rebukes them when they're wrong, in the wrong. But then the last thing I wanted to read, then I'll be done. And this pertains to that very last part of that last verse. He says, those that overcome shall not be hurt by the second death. We've talked a lot about the second death here. Death itself is, I've told you all, there's two definitions. One's annihilation. One is separation from God. And so almost always we see the death mentioned here. Now, something like physical death. We're all going to experience a physical death. But that is the annihilation of the flesh. So that's annihilation. But you'll never experience a ceasing to exist. There is no soul sleep. People like to talk about soul sleep, but I can disprove that by the Scriptures too, I believe. But there is no separation. There's no annihilation. Like Jehovah's Witnesses, they believe that when you die, if you're not a Christian or you're not a Jehovah's Witness, that you're annihilated. Your soul is destroyed. You just cease to exist. But that's not true. When you leave these bodies, you're going to go to one of two places. Your soul is going to depart from this land. It's going to depart from this realm. And your soul is going to go to one of two places. And both of these places are just going to be a time of waiting. Let's say that. So you either go to heaven, your soul will go back to God in heaven, but you're not going to be complete. You're not going to have a body, but you're just going to be a soul. Your soul is going to go back to God from which it came. And so if you're a born-again Christian, when you take your last breath, your life force, your soul, your essence, what is you, your existence, your consciousness, is going to come out of your mouth or your nostrils, and it is going to go back to God from which it came. Or your soul, your life force, your essence is going to come out of your body, and it is going to go to a place of imprisonment called hell. And you will be there and you will be tormented until the day of judgment. If you are in hell, you're awaiting the day of judgment, the end of the millennial reign, when the heavens and the earth are burned up and the heavens are rolled up like a scroll and everything is burned up and there's a new heaven and new earth. Right before the new heaven and new earth, hell itself is going to give up its dead. All those souls that are being imprisoned there are going to come out of hell. The sea is going to give up the dead, and everything's going to give up the dead, and everybody's going to come back to stand before God, all these people out of hell, and they're going to be judged. And Revelation 19, you can read about it. And then those who come out of hell, they're going to be found guilty because their sin debt has not been paid. And what is the penalty of sin? What is death? Separation from God. And so the eternal judgment of God on sin that has not been paid for by Christ because they didn't receive Him will be called the second death. And this will be an eternal death. It will be eternally separated. I used to say eternally separated from God, but that's not really true because God's omnipresent, which means He's everywhere all the time. And so if God's omnipresent, that means His presence is in hell as well, or even in the lake of fire. And so what does it mean? We'll be eternally separated from the goodness and love of God forever. And the only part of God that they will experience for all of eternity is His eternal wrath. So the wrath of God will be very present in the lake of fire. And they will feel the wrath that Christ felt on the cross. The full wrath of God forever and forever and forever. That's what Christ did for us. He took the full wrath of God so that He tasted death for every man. He tasted the separation and the separation from God's goodness and love and felt the full wrath of God, which is what they're going to feel in an eternal hell, is wrath of God poured on them day and night. And so the second death, the judgment, He will cast them into the second death. and that is eternal separation, not from God, but from the goodness and love of God. They'll never experience goodness, and they'll never experience love ever again. And Matthew Henry sums this up really good. He says this second death is unspeakably worse than the first death, both in the dying pangs and agonies of it. And so we talk about dying on earth, as in when we leave our bodies. That is dying because our flesh is being annihilated. Our flesh is giving up the ghost. Our flesh is going to turn back into dirt. So our flesh is dying. It is, as soon as we're born, we start dying. And so eventually your flesh will give up the ghost. Your breath will cease. The life force in this body will be gone. And this flesh will just turn back into dirt. And so the process of dying is unpleasurable because it's a consequence of sin. It's unpleasurable. It can be extremely painful, and it can be extremely filled with terror. Nobody in their right mind has pleasant thoughts. Even these martyrs, they didn't have pleasant thoughts about being eaten by wild animals. They didn't think that that was going to be a wonderful experience. Being burned alive as a candle for Nero. They didn't think that was going to be a wonderful experience. They thought it was an honor to die for the Lord and to drink the cup that he drank from. But the dying part is not a pleasurable experience. It's not supposed to be. It's part of the penalty of our sin. That's why we live in a fallen world, so we're going to suffer death like everybody else. And so that's what he's saying here. He says the dying pangs and agonies of it. Christians, non-Christians alike. We all experience that if we get to the death. Maybe we'll be raptured, praise the Lord. We won't have to experience it. Some people go in their sleep, some people don't feel it. But some people, good people, die horribly. It has nothing to do with your goodness or your righteousness. Some people die horribly. Some people get horrible forms of diseases and so forth. And so Matthew Henry says, in dying pangs and agonies of it, which are the agonies of the soul without any mixture of support, and in the duration, he's talking about the second death now, it is eternal death. He says, dying the death. To die, and this is what caught me, to die and to be always dying. Like you think about the horrors, the sufferings, and the pangs of death. The last moments and if you know people that's died horrible, tragic deaths. Now imagine that experience never stops. It's dying the death eternally. That's the state that you'll eternally be in, is dying the death. All the pains, all the terrors, all the suffering of dying. We all dread dying. It will never stop. It'll be eternal. He said it is dying the death, and he says to die and to always be dying. This is hurtful indeed, fatally hurtful to all who fall under. From this hurtful, this destructive death, Christ will save all his faithful servants. We don't have to taste this ever. The second death shall have no power over those who are partakers of the first resurrection. Because this time, this second death in Revelation 19, see, we've already been raptured. We've already been resurrected. We already have our eternal new bodies. We have nothing to fear of this. This is for all those people who are still in their graves, still in the prison of hell, waiting on the day of judgment, so that they can be cast into this eternal death. It's terrible. Power of the first partakers, the first resurrection. The first death shall not hurt them, and the second death shall have no power over them. We will stop there. Next week, Lord willing, we'll get to Pergamos, and we'll get to those Nicolaitans. I told you that's why I really wanted to get to Pergamos today, but the Nicolaitans is a curious group, because remember, in the first